tonight, and thank you all for coming. So the title of this lecture is a question, and I promise you that I will finish by giving you my answer, but first I will ask for your patience as I beat around the neighboring bushes in order to frame the story that I will be telling in the right way. The story is this: if there is indeed a contradiction between faith and reason, it is not located where we today are likely to think that it is located. It is located somewhere else. And even then, it's not really a contradiction. It's a distinction. So let me begin. I want to start by offering you a couple of examples of how we think and talk about reason and rationality today. They won't be too serious. In popular discussions of economic theory, we find a peculiar but characteristic picture of reason and rationality. In neoclassical economic theory, economic models are strictly formal and mathematical. This is supposedly what makes them rational. The models assume that there are self-interested actors who make decisions based on formal logical principles and cost-benefit analysis, and who have full access to information. And this can then be turned into mathematical models which can be used to predict outcomes. These models shape economic policies. The claim is that if we go along with the models, it will produce economic equilibrium, a perfectly stable economic system. What could be wrong with that? Well, a few things. As we know from painful experience, none of the theoretical models were able to predict the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression in the 1930s. Tragically, reality did not conform to this picture of reason. The great equilibrium did not manifest itself. And the response from mainstream economists has largely been this: there is nothing wrong with the picture of rationality that they paint. The models are reasonable through and through. The tragedy is that we, human beings, are not fully rational creatures. We fail to live up to the gold standard of rationality defined in this abstract and formal way. In other words, the definition of reason and rationality stands. It's we who have failed to live up to it, being the bundle of confused desires that we are. Now, accepting this picture of reason and ourselves would imply that what appears to be the only candidate around for being a rational creature, us humans, turn out not to be rational in a meaningful sense. So there's a form of reason out there. The problem is that the only candidate for possessing it falls terribly short. Well, maybe that's not quite right. Here's a potential candidate that I did not mention a moment ago: the computer. Artificial intelligence might turn out to be the one truly rational creature, if creature is taken here in the widest sense of the term. That is at least a popular argument. The computer is formal logic embodied, and the argument goes far more intelligent than us, poor humans. Our reasoning is faulty and fallible. The computer's is not. Now, in this line of argument, we can recognize a particular temptation, a seductive picture of reason. Human intelligence is manifested, is expressed in a myriad of different ways. Everything from carved inscriptions to ancient temple structures, to the construction of cuckoo clocks, to the writing of great fiction and the painting of masterpieces. All this belongs to the list of expressions of intelligence. And among the many things that we must include in the list is surely also formal logic and mathematics. Now, here's the temptation. We isolate this last and very specific aspect of what it takes to be an intelligent, reasoned, self-conscious being. We perfect this particular aspect and turn it into a powerful tool. Not surprisingly, this tool turns out to be much better at playing chess and doing mathematics than we are. But then we come to wonder if it might not also overtake us in other parts our lives. That it may beat us at writing poetry and literature. And as we do this, we show that we are slowly forgetting that we are creating, that what we did was create a tool. And we begin to worry that this tool is much more rational and intelligent than we are. We lose sight of the fact that this is analogous to asking if a hammer might not be a better carpenter than we are, because it is so much better at hitting nails than our bare hands. Now that is not to say that computers and robots aren't incredibly sophisticated tools. They are. They're just not carpenters. So this is to remind us, in a sort of Wittgensteinian spirit, that we begin to say the most peculiar and incomprehensible things when we lose sight of where our concepts have their home. When we begin to take a secondary and metaphorical use of our concepts more seriously than our everyday use. And here we find a strange picture of reason. Reason is purely formal, mathematical, logical. It is abstract, operating at a distance from our common human sphere of experience, perception, and everyday language. And moreover, reason has become something else. It has become a standard by which we fall short, something we cannot quite attain, something we will turn out to lack, at least in part. Now, how did such a strange picture of reason and ourselves come about? And how does it fit with tonight's topic of the seeming contradiction between reason and faith? Well, at the beginning of the Enlightenment, the early modern philosopher René Descartes argued that everything in the world could be called into question, except the fact that I am thinking. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. That I am thinking remains certain, even as I doubt the existence of everything around me. Because all I can be sure of is that I am thinking. The world that we can be certain of then has to be put back together from this position of the thinking ego. And this can only be done by means of abstract formal reason. The reconstructed world will turn out to be more or less completely shaped by mathematics and geometry, built up from formal principles. And for the rest of the Enlightenment, almost everyone assumes that reason, broadly conceived, operates at a distance from the world of everyday experience. Reason was conceived as a formal operation that takes place in a realm that is separate from how things appear to us in the world of common sense. Now, these developments in the theory of knowledge and reason took place immediately after the emergence of the new sciences in the lobby of Nest, and I do not believe that there's a fire in the lobby at Nest. We can see this because the logical form of the two claims are the same as this. There's a fire in the lobby of Nest, and Sigurd Baark does not believe that there's a fire in the lobby of Nest. No contradiction there. It's perfectly fine. Still, it is obviously the case that I am contradicting myself if I claim it is the case that there is a fire in the lobby at Nest, and I claim that I do not believe that it's the case that there's a fire in the lobby of Nest. What could be more obvious than that? If we take the commitment not to contradict ourselves seriously, then it is obvious that what it is reasonable to claim is different from what a formal logic allows us to claim. The two do not line up. And this is not an issue of our particular psychology, as the great philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein pointed out. If you ask someone if there's a fire in the lobby and the person replies, I believe there is, then you cannot say, don't be irrelevant. I asked you about the fire, not about the state of your mind. I think that's Wittgenstein at his best, by the way. Anyway, no, that's a lie, but he's great in general, but this is good. The problem in the above example concerns what I can claim without contradicting myself. It's precisely the mentioning of the self-conscious I that shows us how reason cannot simply be the same thing as an ideal formal language, like that of the computer. Reason and self-consciousness are somehow intertwined, not in terms of one's particular psychology, as Wittgenstein saw, but because the self-conscious reasoner is responsible for his or her claims or judgments in a particular way. And we cannot get a handle on what reason is without considering this form of responsibility, which depends on the ability to use the first-person I, to be self-conscious, to ascribe beliefs and actions to oneself. Now, this is a much more human, open, and useful picture of what Descartes tried to capture in the more problematic way with the cogito, the I think. So we should keep in mind that it is not the case that the answer, I believe there is, to the question, is there a fire in the lobby of Nest, that this is a claim about one's own mind. It's a claim about what is really the case in reality. So including the self-conscious I in the sentence does not mean that it is suddenly about something other than the fire in the lobby of Nest. When we reason self-consciously, we're not simply concerned with form, with how I happen to be thinking. Rather, form and content come packed together. When I think about the world as a self-conscious subject, my thoughts do not somehow stop short of how the things that I am thinking about actually are. Reasoning and reality are just not two different spheres, because I'm precisely making myself responsible for claiming something about how things actually are out there in the world in a particular way. In other words, subjectivity and objectivity come packed together. We cannot have one without the other, as Descartes mistakenly thought we could. We have no idea of what it would be for something to be objectively how things are without a subjective perspective that we are subtracting. This is how things are, not just because I'm standing here seeing him in that way. So subjectivity and objectivity are not contradictory. Rather, self-consciousness, subjectivity, is the precondition for enjoying an objective idea of the world, and vice versa. Now, for those of you with a deeper philosophical interest, this is essentially the lesson that Kant taught us. This brings us to the issue of time. The ideal of abstract and formal reasoning is a system of deductive relations that can operate independently of any particular time. Like mathematics, it is pure form without content. Yet our actual self-conscious reasoning is certainly time-bound, because we are time-bound. The world as it unfolds in space and time, and we along with it, are the primary object of our reasoning, because our self-conscious and finite lives unfold in space and time. What we perceive and do takes place at particular moments within the flow of time. And that is why telling a story about ourselves, about the world, it's such a central aspect of how we reason and construct meaning in the world. Telling a particular story gives us an ordering of facts, actions, and events which allow us to discover relations that we could not arrive at through formal deductive logic. If any of you are curious, this is Sebastian Roden, by the way. This ordering of space and time in a narrative form is essential to making sure that our reasoning is correct. So until now, I have barely mentioned the issue of faith. So now I want to take a pause from this more philosophical story that I've been telling and examine an interesting argument in Martin Luther's theological masterpiece, The Bondage of the Will. As some of you may know, The Bondage of the Will is one of the central texts of the Reformation. It's written in 1525, so roughly 100 years before the works of Galileo and Descartes. It's Luther's contribution to a fierce polemic that raged concerning the freedom of the human will. Luther's worthy opponent in this debate is the humanist scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, who has defended some measure of human willing as playing a part in our relationship to God. So in The Bondage of the Will, Luther attacks Erasmus with all the irony, ridicule, and unconstrained anger that makes Luther the Luther we love. In particular, Erasmus has an appeal to reason that becomes the target of the reformer's wrath. Luther writes, "Reason interprets the scriptures of God by her own inferences and syllogisms, and turns them any direction she pleases. She, reason, talks nothing but follies and absurdities, especially when she starts displaying her wisdom on sacred objects." Now, this is an astonishing passage. First, in the passage itself, Luther implies that reason is essentially unreasonable. Reason leads to follies and absurdities. It is haphazard and random, lacking direction. Second, the passage is striking because in this text, Luther goes on to produce a careful argument that repeatedly points out the contradictions of his opponent's reasoning. It seems clear that Luther is, well, reasoning. He's giving reasons, critiquing his opponent's arguments by showing how it falls short of the most basic obligation of a rational argument, not to contradict itself. He's telling a story where his argument seems reasonable and his opponent, Erasmus's argument, does not. And yet Luther feels free to tell us that reason is useless. Now, I submit to you that what is really at stake here is a question of definition. By any common sense definition, what Luther is doing is reasoning. And yet he defines reason as something that stands apart from his actual practice of reasoning. Reason, he claims, is abstract in the word's original meaning of drawn apart or drawn away. Now, I find it interesting that Luther's text presents us with a picture of reason that develops a picture of reason that in many ways anticipates the problematic picture of reason that develops through the Enlightenment and that we can recognize as surprisingly common today. Luther's text shows us that tonight's topic is not simply something that is imposed on theology from without. The seeming contradiction between the two is as much a child of the Reformation as of the Enlightenment. Now, Luther should throw the concept of reason overboard to declare it useless. Wow. But the problem is that the later Enlightenment thinkers take him seriously. They've come to share something like his picture of reason, and they think it's insane to rage against it. For them, since reason is not immediately present in the world of experience and everyday practice, it becomes an ideal to be realized, a formula for reconstructing the world. And then the thought emerges that we ought to conform to reason, to shape the world and ourselves in light of a formal structure or operation that is now currently concealed, even hindered, but nevertheless should be implemented. And so we end up with the paradoxical notions that I've already discussed. So Luther creates a straw man, calls it reason, beats it up. And the astonishing thing is that the straw man is seized on only one short century later and taken over as an ideal picture of reason. Now, what I am going to argue now is that when this strange ideal begins to come apart, we begin to see a more persuasive picture of reason that is much closer to what Luther is actually doing in the bondage of the will. So let me return to the story that I've been telling. We have an Enlightenment picture of reason that we can recognize as powerfully present in the imagination today. This particular picture creates deep problems, and we can see how it cannot do justice to how we actually think and reason. We cannot really fit it in with our human life. If we hold on to the picture, a definition of reason that makes it very hard to see how reason is reasonable. So either we maintain that this notion of reason is correct, and then we have, for example, a very hard time connecting it to the lives and thoughts and actions of reasonable creatures, us. Reason is reasonable, we are not. Or, still accepting this as the actual picture of what reason is, we end up arguing, like Luther, that reason is essentially unreasonable and leads us astray. So as long as we stick to this picture of reason, it seems to me very hard to see a way out of this deadlock. Now, I think when this picture of abstract and formalized reason begins to look shaky, so does the contradiction between faith and reason that comes packed with it. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to scrap the picture of reason and see if we can do better. And this is not an anti-philosophical argument. In fact, it's the argument of none other than the great philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. Hegel is known for the claim, what is real is the rational, and what is rational is real. That has been taken to be a completely absurd claim, which it is, if we stick to the picture of reason that I have been describing this far. But that's not Hegel's argument. Hegel's argument is different. His claim is that reason is simply what describes what thinking and acting beings like us do. It's what specifically characterizes self-conscious beings. It's a particular way of inhabiting the world. It describes us in light of our capacity as thinking beings to give grounds for acting and reacting in certain ways. And we can ask other thinking and speaking beings why they did what they did or said what they said, and we can expect them to give an answer. We can explain ourselves, we can give reasons, and we can point out that some reasons are good and some reasons are bad. And they are particularly bad if they contradict other reasons that we give or have given, or if they're contradicted by what we actually did or do. Using the concept of reason is simply another way of capturing a crucial aspect of who we are. It's a way of talking about what sets us apart from other beings. Now, of course, this capacity that we have consists of many different features. As self-conscious beings, we theorize about the world. We also act in the world and aim to act in the best way possible. We aim to discover how to flourish. We theorize about our actions. We do geometry. We engage in mathematics. We write epic poems and books that give us insight into our own condition as self-conscious speaking and acting beings. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves as individuals and as a species. We tell ourselves stories about the world, and we come to see that some of these stories end up being confirmed or contradicted by what happened later. We come to see that some stories were better than others, included and ordered things in a better way. And all that is part of what reason is. Now, Hegel will say that reason is immediate. Here's a way to picture what that means. When we have learned to read what is written on billboards, on shops, on windows, on street signs, books, etc., is instantaneously transparent to us. We read it with little or no effort. It's simply part of the way the world appears to us, which does not require any particular struggle or abstraction on our part. The same goes for reason. It's what we do. Once we have gained the language to express ourselves as thinking and self-conscious beings, the beings that we are, reason is simply present to us without requiring a special skill. Hegel writes somewhere, in lesser logic I think, that hearing a horse carriage go by on the street outside, through the window, is a syllogism, a logical inference. It's an inference that one draws from hearing the sound of the wheels and hoofs on the cobblestones. That's reason. And like reading, Some might be quicker or slower than others. Some might find this or that topic more interesting. Some may be able to train themselves to read with greater concentration or attention. But it's absurd to say that someone who is reading a children's book is not reading, and actual reading only takes place when you're reading Newton's Principia or some such thing. The same goes for reason. As with reading, there is no qualitative difference between what we go about doing every day and a more concentrated or attentive effort that we can train ourselves to do if we have the inclination or the time. So Hegel is not alone in this view. Thinkers like Wittgenstein or Hans-Georg Gadamer have made similar arguments. Perhaps the greatest living philosopher, John Henry McDowell, has explicitly turned to Hegel to show us how to get out of the strange problems that the modern picture of reason inevitably gets us into. And in this lecture, my approach has essentially been, well, Hegelian, with a sound twist of Wittgenstein for spice. As a critical aside, and you can take this or leave it, I think that the misguided picture of reason remains so prevalent because it allows some people to divide the world into those who are reasonable and those who are not. Or at least those who can see reason and those who cannot. And I think this division often matches nicely with the division between those who lead and those who should be led. In short, I think the primary function of the problematic picture of reason is ideological. That's why it remains. Its function is to support an ideology of repression and control. Again, this is my hunch. You're free to do with it what you like. Take it with a piece of salt. So I want to return briefly to Luther's bondage of the will. As I mentioned earlier, one of the paradoxical aspects of the bondage of the will is that Luther paints this negative picture of reason, all the while he's clearly reasoning. Considering the Hegelian picture of reason, this should not surprise us. Not to reason is hard. To refrain from reasoning is as hard as to stop oneself from reading street signs. It requires effort. So what Luther actually shows us, and shows us by what he is doing and not by what he is saying, is that there appears to be no contradiction between faith and reason. In practice, when we see that a person who believes in the Lordship of Jesus Christ reasons just as well as anybody else. In fact, Luther has to paint a very strange picture of reason in order to get the contradiction between faith and reason to seem, well, reasonable. Now, history moves in weird and unpredictable ways, and what was Luther's straw man finds a home in the Enlightenment and keeps causing trouble today. But if we just ignore what Luther says concerning reason, and stick to examining what he is in fact doing, the contradiction seems to dissolve. And we need a long and strange story to tell us and convince us that the contradiction should in fact be there. Now that last bit is important. Even if there is not a contradiction between faith and reason, exactly where Martin Luther and the Enlightenment thought that it was, it might still lie elsewhere. We may just have been speaking about it wrong for the last several years. Luther's bondage of the will can help us understand something about this issue as well. Help us see where the contradiction might actually lie. So a few pages prior to his attack on reason, Luther discusses Erasmus's use of the term free choice. The point of the brief discussion is that Erasmus actually wanted to write about vertical choice, or mutable choice, Luther says, but he used the wrong concept, namely free choice. When we say free choice, we usually mean something more than the ability of the will to turn this way or that. And that was what Erasmus was actually after. You might, Luther writes, perhaps rightly attribute some measure of choice to man, but to attribute free choice to him in relation to divine things is too much. For the term free choice, in the judgment of everyone's ears, means, strictly speaking, that which can do and does, in relation to God whatever it pleases, uninhibited by any law or sovereign authority. Now here is a straightforward contradiction between faith and a potential capacity or human power. We can rephrase it in this way. Unless there is a relation of sovereignty or power by God over the world, including humanity, arguably the entire edifice of faith collapses, and there is a way of thinking about human freedom that appears to undermine any such relation or sovereignty or authority. Now, getting to the heart of the correct picture of reason that Hegel and others give us, a way to do that is to say that self-consciousness, freedom, and reason come packed together. If we speak about one, we'll also have to speak about the other two. Let me briefly explain how. Well, that reason and self-consciousness go together, I think I've already shown. Reason is just a way of describing what self-conscious beings, what makes self-conscious beings what they are, what separates them from other creatures. Creatures that are not self-conscious and who cannot make claims and judgments and cannot assume responsibility for their actions and thoughts. This capacity gives us a form of freedom that we do not share with other species. We can make the grounds and causes for why we think or do what we think or do clear. We can state them out loud. We can explain them. Now, making those grounds and causes explicit is giving reasons. When we articulate our reasons and give expressions to our grounds and causes for thinking or doing this or that, we take responsibility for them. And this necessarily involves evaluating them. We can judge whether some reasons are good or bad reasons for doing or thinking this or that. This capacity to evaluate reasons that we give or are given is essential to what it is to reason. So where does the standard or the measure by which we evaluate reasons come from? Well, the short story is that it can only come from our self-conscious capacity to reason, this form of life that we are. It comes from our common practice of reasoning, our particular human form of life. We must recognize it as reasonable, as a useful standard. As reasonable beings, we set our own standards and measures for what is reasonable, for what is a good reason and a bad reason. And this capacity is a capacity to make rules for oneself. And that's what we moderns know as autonomy, self-legislation. And this means that we, self-conscious, reasoning beings, set our own standards for what is useful, sensible, reasonable, valuable, etc. Now, here's the tricky bit. This form of evaluation seems straightforwardly to include the usefulness, sensibleness, reasonableness, and value of the concept God. And if that's the case, we find ourselves faced with an actual contradiction between who we appear to be as self-conscious reasoning beings and as creatures of faith. The moment that God is subject to our standards for what is useful or valuable, the very idea of God begins to seem senseless. And this implicit consciousness is the actual modern challenge to religion. Forget about the rest. If our norms determine what is right or wrong to affirm or deny concerning God, then our speech about God becomes indistinguishable from our speech about our own values. It becomes indistinguishable from talking about ourselves. As the great theologian Baark put it, then speaking about God is actually just talking about ourselves in a very loud voice. So here's a contradiction that might actually be real. It seems if we want to get our talk of reason straight and dissolve the superficial tension between faith and reason, then we do end up with a solid picture of reason, but also with a much more subtle and far-reaching contradiction, which threatens to empty the concept of God of any meaning. If we think through the consequences of the sensible picture of reason, God, assuming there's God, appears, at best, to be an irrelevant creature that exists on the margins of the world, subject to our whims and values. Of course, the question is whether the concept of God has a use or a meaning that is not caught within the domain that is shaped by the norms of the self-conscious human subject. Is there a way to talk about God that signals a limit to the powers and the capacities of self-consciousness without itself depending on the very norms and standards by which we shape the world? In other words, is there a way to speak about God where it is God, not us, that sets the standards and norms for what it is right to say about God? If this kind of talk about God is possible, then we would get out of this pinch where we seem to, in Luther's words, to do in relation to God whatever we please, uninhibited by any law or sovereign authority. And here everything depends on the actual, practical premises for speaking about God. In other words, it matters where we're speaking from, what we're doing when the concept God comes to be part of the conversation. If it is a general concept of the divine, then there's no way out of the theological dilemma. If the concept of God is just readily available for us to make use of, as if we already know what we're talking about when we mention God, we remain caught within the scope of our norms and standards. And that would make faith an unnecessary detour for getting back to our actual business, talking about ourselves. So I will now change gears slightly and narrow in on a particular practice where the Word of God is used. Namely, speaking about the one who is the Father of Jesus Christ, revealed by the power of the Holy Spirit. Or differently, I will be speaking about the biblical God of the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament. That's not speaking about God in general. We're not speaking about the genus God, and then mentioning that, oh, by the way, this God happens to be of the species triune. When we speak about the triune God, we speak from a particular practice, where God is first and foremost a word in a series of texts. And those texts have to teach us what the word God means. And it's a deep Reformed insight that we do not know what the word God stands for in any meaningful sense until we begin to read these texts. The New Testament tells us that we only come to understand who God is when we know the story of Jesus Christ. Actual knowledge of God is inseparable from the singular moment when our norms and standards, the entire scope of our self-conscious lives and mastery, cease to be relevant or useful. That is the moment of the death of the Messiah of Israel, Jesus of Nazareth, on the cross. And this is important. Death is the moment when the entire sphere of our self-conscious life is brought to a grinding halt. Our death is a limit that we cannot circumvent, cannot get around. It's an absolute limit that we cannot master, where everything is out of our hands. The Christian scriptures tell us that this death is where God speaks. God is revealed in this definitive judgment on all our claims to speak on behalf of eternity. This is where God is known, and known as Lord. Reading along with these texts, we are pushed to acknowledge that Jesus is the Messiah, precisely because he reveals God at the moment when God brings all our claims on God to an end. He reveals how limited our powers and capacities actually are in the face of time and eternity. And the resurrection means that when we are brought to silence, God tells us who God is by raising Jesus from the dead. This is the one who created from nothing and who rules both life and death. In other words, what is an absolute limit to us is not a limit to the freedom and sovereignty of God. Here the concept of God takes on a sense, a meaning, which explicitly stands in contradiction to all that is within the reach of our norms and standards. When we say that God is triune, this encounter with a power beyond our own means and measures is what we're referring to. It means that God is the Father whom we know only through the Son by the power of the Holy Spirit. In other words, that God is triune is another way of saying what the New Testament texts push us to acknowledge, that God sets the standards and norms for actual knowledge of God. And the concepts of Father, Son, and Spirit are biblical scriptural concepts. These concepts are, for lack of a better word, forced on us as we think along with the Christian account of the revelation of God. Acknowledging our own unconditional limits in the encounter with God, in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, entails that we do not get to choose the language in which we give expression to who God is. That language is chosen for us. The language of our limits is the language of God's revelation in these texts. With a modern slogan, there is no meta-language. In other words, this encounter draws us into the biblical scriptures in a particular way and gives form to a particular practice. Between reading and proclamation, it draws us into the story that God tells us about God and ourselves in the books of the Bible, the history of the covenant of grace. And this does not happen in the abstract. It's precisely not a form of knowledge that we can have once and for all. It does not consist of the building blocks of a metaphysical system. In fact, it's part of the acknowledgement of our unconditional limits that we realize and recognize that the knowledge is not ours to keep. As the one who is per definition sovereign over and against our capacities, norms and powers, the triune God undermines, or again, with a modern term, deconstructs any attempt to make the biblical revelation ours. To know it and hear it and reflect on it is a continuous living practice, which calls us back again and again to recognize that we do not contribute to this knowledge. It is and remains something we must be told, something that does not allow itself to be brought within the scope of our standards and norms. Now, this constitutes the unbridgeable difference between a genuine Reformed theological praxis and all forms of fundamentalism. The biblical witness to the revelation of the triune God continues to undermine all our attempts to turn it into a stable system or order, to make it our own. Actual knowledge of God is first and foremost expressed in a radical praxis that, again and again, calls our various theoretical constructs into question. Now, in this upbuilding theological discourse, have I lost sight of tonight's topic in my enthusiasm? I do not think so. Rather, I have sought to capture how we are drawn into a particular language that calls us to reason, to give an account of ourselves in a certain way. I've stressed that we're drawn into this praxis through these texts. And as we are, we come to know something. We come to acknowledge and speak about God in a particular way that also reveals to us our own insurmountable limits. And knowing our limits is knowing who we are. As I mentioned earlier, telling a story is an essential part of what reasoning is. To come to understand ourselves and our arguments and judgments, we need to order events, actions, and causes within a temporal framework. We need a story to help us find meaning and thus to reason. And here, in these texts, we are drawn into the story that God tells us about the relationship between God and us, that puts our self-conscious capacities to work to have us thinking along. A while back, I mentioned René Descartes, I don't know if you remember, and the cogito. Descartes' essential claim was cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Now, even if we don't stick with Descartes, this, I think, is self-consciousness, the capacity to use the first-person pronoun, to say I. That is what the little O at the end stands for. It stands for a form of thinking where self-consciousness and the self-conscious subject ultimately sets the norms and standards for what is correct or incorrect, good or bad, etc. Now, I submit to you that there is a form of self-conscious life, as saturated with reason and thought as all other forms of self-conscious life. Only here, God's revelation as the triune Lord sets the standards and norms. And this is the life of faith. It's the life of the credo, the I believe, rather than the life of the cogito. What distinguishes the credo from the cogito is that we enter into a form of thought that comes to us from outside our capacities and that we cannot make our own in any stable or permanent way. With the credo, we're called to reason through a story that we could not tell ourselves, and that we will have to be told again and again. And that is the crucial difference between cogito and credo. With the credo, we're speaking of a self-consciously had form of knowledge and reasoning that comes to us from outside the reach of our own powers and remains something that cannot become our property. This story about God and ourselves, the story of the covenant, has a beginning. It's a beginning that speaks about things that are essentially outside our power and mastery. It's the story of a time and a beginning that both exceeds and embraces our particular stories. It frames them. This beginning is the strange, beautiful, imaginative, and poetic saga that we find in Genesis, the first book of the Bible. It's the saga of God's creation of the cosmos. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So begins the story that we cannot tell ourselves. Within this great narrative, there's plenty of space for all the stories that we can tell ourselves. Within it, all the cogito stories can claim their own space and have their own integrity. Within it, they can even find a meaning and a life that they often struggle to muster on their own. The self-affirmation of the revealed triune God, our Creator and Redeemer, does not exclude these stories, theories, and reasons. God's history with us does not exclude the self-conscious life of God's creatures. Rather, it invites us in. As the great medieval theologian Anselm of Canterbury wrote, "Credo ut intelligam," I believe in order that I may understand. Thank you for listening patiently.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring and interesting talk. But I have a problem with your move from the universal to the particular. You know, the analysis was of reason and human reasonability. And then it became dependent on the Old and the New Testament. What about other religions or atheists? Do they have another kind of reasonable or reason or living their rationality?
Sure. Yes, I think that was my point. I think my point was precisely that we can't isolate reason to a particular form of practice or a particular sort of meta-language. If we do that, all, pardon me, hell breaks loose. So yeah, why not? Now, do I think that a general use of the concept God falls prey to the Hegelian lure? Yes, unconditionally. And do I think that within the particular practice that constitutes the church, there's a way of getting out of that? Yes, absolutely. Might there be other practices where that's possible? I don't know. I'm a theologian. in the Reformed tradition. And I can show you how this happens. And I can show you how that happens in a way, I didn't mention that here, but there's a different part of the argument, sort of riffing on Anselm. I can show you how that happens in a way that is exceptionally convincing. Now, I am also, for better or worse, a student of Baark. And there is a little marvelous thing about Baark that not a lot of people know, which is that he has a little discourse on Pure Lands Buddhism. And he says, well, there's something here in the way that Pure Lands Buddhism talks about revelation and the need for revelation, and death, that kind of sounds a lot like what I'm doing here. But, you know, that's good for them if that's the case. I'm a Protestant theologian, this is my business, and this is what I do, and I don't meddle in other people's business. I think something like that is my answer. Now, I remain fairly convinced and that there are a lot of ways of talking about God that are misguided and that do fall victim to the Hegelian dual, and I'm, again, like I said, damn convinced that my way of doing it doesn't. Can I mention just now that we're here that there was actually, a lot of these have been Friedrich pictures, and there was a picture of Friedrich that just went on Sotheby's. I'd never seen it before. It's a great day.
Could you just expand on this notion of Hegelian work?
Let's take the microphone.
What is the
Everybody
Hegelian
here.
work? That's the Irish question.
Well, it is the fact that with self-consciousness, our packed with self-conscious reasoning in the way that it makes sense to talk about self-conscious reasoning is at the basis a capacity to give value judgments. Right? And those value judgments is what sets the standards of what is useful, what is rational, etc. They're sort of the rock bottom of rationality. Right? That's also the capacity to set rules for oneself, right? To determine the scope of a concept, the usefulness of a given concept. And what I'm saying is, once you do that, you end up where Hegel is, right? Which is to say, look, when Christianity talks about this, it uses kind of picture language. It's like a kid's book, right? But its essential lesson is that self-conscious reasoning, the life of the spirit, is the ultimate measure of that which is true. Whatever is true is true. With Aristotle, right? Of the things that there are that they are, and of the things that are not that they are not, right? Like that's the basic scope of it. And that's where, you know, the concept of God enters into that, if it is used in general. So that would be my response to that.
So it makes revelation possible.
Well, that's what I'm arguing it doesn't. It depends on what you mean by revelation. If you talk about it in general terms, yes. In general terms. But again,
I sure thank you. There is one thing I want to ask about the faith and the feeling. To me, the faith has a lot of feeling, and the reason has a lot of reason. In the faith, sometimes if you talk about the Holy Spirit, sometimes if you do something, or if you are wherever you are, you feel like the Holy Spirit is there somewhere. If you have problems, also the Holy Spirit can encounter you, talking as Christian. But in the reason, you said many times, God is offering this or this, and make you feel so or so. God is offering to us a word. We understand. And if we don't understand, we believe in it. I don't see a lots of imagination in the Bible or in the New Testament or whatever it is between the faith and the reason. I think it's much more clear than many suppositions. I'm sorry not to contradict you. I'm talking about my own feeling. I may be wrong. I don't see much more confusion in many suppositions if if so or so or so. It's very philosophical. And at the time I could not also maybe follow all the supposition or so. These are thoughts. These are not criticisms. These are thoughts. I talked about how I felt in reading or hearing this lecture. Thanks a lot.
Can I just very quickly say that I think that's wonderful. And if I've given the impression that I somehow want to sort of exercise the spiritual life of faith, I by no means want to do that. I mean, I think I want to take things down to sort of a very dare I say reasonable level. What I do want to say is that whatever experiences and encounters and feelings that one does have as one speaks within the Christian church, the reading of these texts has to be part of it, or it becomes something else. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you.
I'm in pediatrics, so I want to ask you, self-consciousness, it doesn't start, at birth. It starts around the age of 2 or 3. Does it develop? So somebody who's 40 has more self-consciousness than somebody who's 10, and so on?
I want to have like a really kind of relatively minimal definition of self-consciousness. It's the capacity to say I. That's at least how it's expressed. I would probably say it's there before that. But I have a particular story about how I think thought and language relates. But yeah. So I don't want it to be. Certainly not self-consciousness. What I don't mean by it is like a sense of embarrassment or a sense of, like the whole story about one's place in the world or something like that. I mean a relatively simple thing that I can make a judgment and I can be responsible for it. Or do something and somebody says, why'd you do that? And I said, I'm sorry, I didn't know I was doing that. It's minimal.
Thank you for this lecture. I want to ask you, can faith be a part of our self-consciousness, or we have to look to faith as a superior to our self-consciousness?
No, thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question. No, I don't think that faith is superior to our self-consciousness. Faith is a way in which we self-consciously relate to something. In this case, a series of texts and concepts that force themselves upon us in these texts. But the self-consciousness is the same. It's just here there's a different relation. And I think I can capture that, for those who like to have a nifty concept, I think I can make a distinction between two forms of self-conscious life. And I can call one cogito, and I can call the other credo. And I can say credo is what happens here and here, when we read this and think that, and this, that, and the other thing. But I don't mean to imply that faith is somehow something that is above our self-conscious lives. It's just a part of it. It's a particular part, singular even.
Are there any other questions?
I'm going to ask about Hegel again. Should I just do it after?
Maybe, yeah. Then maybe I'll ask a last question. I want to carry a bit further Dr. Hamedi's question about other religions, other faiths, and so on. Other practices and other faiths. Does reason have a role, or does reason have any business in comparing, contrasting, and evaluating different practices, different faiths?
Yeah, I suppose it would, yeah. That depends certainly on what you mean by that.
Then there's a way of judging what is maybe true or false or deep or not so deep or profound and not so profound between different practices. And that is the task of reason also.
Sure.
So reason can be critical of faith.
Sure, reason can be critical of all manner of things. The question is simply You know, the reason can be critical of reasonable practices. Of course it can. Why not?
I just want to clarify. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Dr. Baark, and please join us for a cup of coffee and more discussion.